of course, other partners on some of the climate goals and things like that, and making sure we hold folks accountable.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Juanita. Okay, so I do want to just start off by saying that we are excited about potentially partnering with the MBTA advisory board on sort of thinking through, exactly, like, we know what the legal requirements are, but working backward, what does that actually mean in terms of the procurement decisions that the T and NRTAs are making. So my hope is that we can have this conversation today, but that this is not the only conversation that we are having, and that we can really talk about how are we partnering together so that we can kind of hold the relevant agencies accountable. So with that, I'm going to share my screen here. Just give me one sec. Okay, can you see these slides? Okay, awesome. So there are multiple laws and policies that have come out in recent years that I wanted to talk through. So we have the climate law from 2021, which we for short call the roadmap law. So this is an act creating a next generation plan for Massachusetts climate policy. And in particular, this is the law that sets the stage for a fairly aggressive reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So the law required EEA, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, to come up with certain limits for how much we can emit from our transportation sector. And the law requires, in particular, that we have to achieve by 2025, which is really soon, a reduction of 33% of our greenhouse gas emissions below the 1990 level within 3 years, and then by a 50% reduction by the 1990 level by 2030. And these numbers may sound relatively challenging to meet. However, the determination that just came out a couple of months ago shared that we are already at about 31% below the 1990 levels in the year 2020. So it seems very likely that we will meet the 2025 threshold and probably don't have to do a whole lot more. I will also say the reason that I think we are close to meeting that threshold is because of the pandemic. Emission, I mean, as we all know, traffic was significantly reduced, travel was significantly reduced. So that just, had to happen. But I have heard the leaders at Energy and Environmental Affairs say, oh, we're very much on track to get to 2025. And they've used it a bit as an excuse to not do more work, I would say, going forward. So then there is a requirement specific to the transportation sector, which is the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, that we reach 18% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2025. And so this is the place where I think is going to be harder because we just haven't done that much in the transportation realm. And then it's a 34% reduction by 2030. So that's, going to be very challenging to do. Something else that I wanted to just mention about this roadmap law is there are requirements for agencies, which would include MassDOT and MBTA, to consider environmental justice when making decisions. So if there is a project or some sort of, major service change, there's going to need to be an assessment of how that impacts communities of color, low-income communities, and limited English proficient neighborhoods. So we certainly at CLF, we've been pushing for environmental justice considerations in many MBTA decisions. They've ignored us so far, but to the extent the advisory board can support and amplify that message, I think it would be enormously helpful. So next up is the climate law that just passed in August of this year, the Clean Energy and Offshore Wind Law. So that law specifically set some some targets that I think are really relevant to MBTA. So there is a goal to transition to zero emission buses. I put this in order of how it shows up in the statute, but I will just say there is a requirement after 2030 for any bus procurements to be zero emission buses. And then by 2040, the 100% of the T bus fleet has to be zero emission vehicles. I think many of us on this call know that the lifetime of an MBTA bus on the road is usually longer than 10 years. So let's say that there's a procurement made on December 29th of 2029, that is not going to be, done on the roads by, January 1st of 2040. So certainly that just doesn't make sense. You're going to have to work backward to stop making procurements of internal combustion engine buses before 2030 in order to meet the 2040 goal. So there is the requirement in this law to identify the vehicles, so the type of zero emission bus technologies that are out there. This is a requirement for MassDOT and the T to work together to sort of produce this report about a schedule for constructing facilities and related infrastructure to support a zero emission bus fleet. So it includes identifying, bus maintenance facility upgrades, future sites for new facilities, and then scheduling retirements of those internal combustion engine buses, as well as the purchase schedule. And part of the requirements are to identify, bus and fuel types, I would say within the existing fleet, and then a goal to transition them out. The number of zero emission buses purchased. And I think the answer is that there's still only 5 zero emission buses in the fleet of 1,000 buses. And then just timeline for retirement. The law requires there to be a electric vehicle coordinating council, and the MBTA general manager or his or her designee needs to sit on that council. That hasn't been convened yet, but that's certainly something that the T has a responsibility to be a part of. So essentially by January of 2023, MassDOT, working with the MBTA, has to analyze if there's any challenges with putting electric vehicle charging stations at MBTA commuter rail parking lots or subway stations. And they have to complete this study looking at a time frame of kind of summer of last year through early summer of this year. And they are required by July of 2024 to install a minimum number of electric vehicle charging stations. So some of those are in the commuter rail parking lots, 5 in the commuter rail lots, 5 in subway station parking lots, and then 1 charging station at a ferry terminal parking lot. There needs to be MassDOT recommendations for creating an incentive to develop and maintain zero emission buses. Sorry, this should say zero emission vehicles and zero emission buses. And then this is the timeline around, oops, I'm sorry. You're seeing my fast work trying to create this for today. So there needs to be these deadlines. Again, I was mentioning the 2030 and 2040 requirements to cease operating MBTA internal combustion engine buses. And then I wanted to talk about some of the federal laws and policies because these are relevant and we might actually see some changes in the near months that's going to affect the MBTA. So first, there is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and that doesn't provide any sort of directives in terms of mandating purchasing electric vehicles necessarily for the MBTA, but it does set aside specific amounts of funding for electric vehicle charging infrastructure and carbon reduction programs focusing on transportation projects. And that money really is available, and we should be calling on the T to be seeking out that funding in order to achieve the transition to zero emission buses, and then also rail. There is no law requiring electric commuter rail, although CLF and others have been working on legislation, and we will refile bills next session to try to change that. There's also the Inflation Reduction Act that sets aside $1 billion for clean heavy duty vehicles. So we're talking, buses, moving construction equipment, for example, that the MBTA is likely to use, and other vehicles that I think the T would need to rely on. And then I wanted to point out there's a federal Department of Transportation rule that's been proposed, and comments are due today. We are submitting comments in support of this rule that would require greenhouse gas emission reductions in the transportation sector. In particular, it would require state Department of Transportations and the metropolitan planning organizations to set declining carbon dioxide targets, and then a method for measuring and reporting emissions from those fleets. And that would obviously include the MBTA. So my sense is that comments are going to be considered over the next couple of months, and then I would expect that the federal DOT is going to come out with final regulations that are essentially law at some point in 2023. So that's all I have. I'm happy to open it up for discussion. I know I just kind of threw a lot at you, and I don't know, Brian, if this was what you were hoping for or not. Brian, go for it.
Well, thank you, Stacy. I know this sort of came out of the blue at you. And let me see if I can explain why. In trying to think about how the advisory board can best influence T policy, especially around his capital program, I'm the kind of person that likes to know sort of what constraints or targets or whatnot they're supposed to be working to. I can tell you, nobody knows any of the information you just explained at the T or EEA. And the reason I know this is because that's where I started trying to get this presentation put together. And I think, as I mentioned to you, everyone said, oh no, talk to CLF. Oh no, talk to CLF, which is disheartening on the one hand, that the implementing agencies either don't know or don't want to know. But at the same time, it's great that folks like you are here, and Juanita are here to to not only know these things, but also keep them in line if need be. Yeah. And so, as I heard you give this or watched you give this, two things came to my mind. One is, you should definitely be presenting this to the MBTA's board of directors. I guarantee you they don't know what these requirements are. And as they go to approve capital plans in March, April, May of 23, they need to know this stuff, because it's gonna, they're doing 5-year capital programs, for 2028, which are going to start hitting that 2040 requirement. Same with the Boston MPO. I would highly encourage you, and I will ask this if you agree, to give this presentation to the Boston MPO, because I guarantee you they don't know. I didn't know, and I'm a pretty active member. We're doing the 28-29 tip right now. So, we're already programming 6-7 years out, or 5 years out rather, excuse me. So really important stuff here, and also things that the T needs to be aware of, and definitely should be aware of. And I guess I had my question for you. With respect to the roadmap law, it almost sounds like you're saying that the T has to do the equivalent of an equity analysis for environment. Did I hear you say that correctly? And am I understanding it?
So it's not for everything, but
Okay.
it's for anything that would trigger an environmental review. such as if there's a service change that would affect levels greater than 10%, that triggers both an equity analysis for the Federal Transit Administration, as well as an environmental justice assessment under state law. And that's a new component of the roadmap law. And we are testing it at every chance we can at CLF because this applies to multiple agencies, not just the MBTA. And the MBTA has never done a good job on these equity analyses.
So yeah, I guess who would do that, and how?
So it's Lindsay Heffernan's team that should be
Oh, yeah.
doing it.
No, I mean the actual EJ assessment. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it would be that team.
Well, they have to do it
So
internally.
it's the agency, or the authority would have to do it and then present it to the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act office to sign off to say that it was complete.
Got it. Awesome.
And I can actually, it's good. I'm glad you're asking this. I should add this to the slide.
And again, sorry, folks, for monopolizing this. Feel free to jump in, but I guess right now the T just gets CTPS to do their equity analyses. Do you see them also getting someone else to do these sort of things? Because it's pretty, it's a big deal. It's a real big deal, and I can see why they are reluctant to do it, but at the same time, they have to do it. And we also have to review any major service changes over 10%. So if we can work with you on that, please know that we will. And we're just starting to do that for bus network redesign. So this might be a good test case.
That's great. Yeah, I know we've submitted detailed comments on bus network redesign. And I don't know, Juanita, if you just want to share what we've said about the environmental justice piece.
Sure. I think we had primary concerns about the engagement, the connectivity, and then the lack of the equity analysis for the service changes. And I think when we talk to municipal partners, as well as like other advocacy organizations, there hadn't been real consultation with them or the writers about, not only the impacts of like the actual route changes, but like how it would I think isolate communities from like certain social and other kinds of services. So there's I think multiple layers of environmental and just like justice impacts to the at least the initial proposed map.
Absolutely. No, and as they come towards a November vote before their board of directors, we're just starting to get geared up to do our thing on it. So I'd be happy to work with you on that as the new maps come out or the new proposals come out. We're actually having the sort of final version before our rapid transit committee coming up. So I'll share that information with you folks, and we can definitely talk.
So I have some questions, but I guess before I dive in, I was just curious if anybody else had any questions for Stacy or Juanita. Okay. So I'll go ahead and ask mine. One of the things, well, I think this is all great, moving towards greening our transportation sector. One of my concerns, honestly, is the grid and the resiliency of the grid. And do you know who would be the best person or people we can speak to make sure that the Commonwealth is really thinking about that and planning appropriately? I'm also curious too about any potential opportunities for like vehicle to grid, opportunities there. So
I love that you're asking this question. You clearly are very knowledgeable about this. So I think the Department of Public Utilities is the state entity, the regulatory authority that has to approve any upgrades to the grid. We are very active in all of the cases before the Department of Public Utilities and asking them to think about both vehicle to grid integration, as well as speeding up the amount of clean energy feeding our grid and updating the meters that we use in order to allow for better rates for electric vehicle charging stations. So for example, what we've been pushing for is much lower rates for people to charge vehicles kind of overnight or at times when the overall grid is not stressed. So the grid tends to be sort of at its peak each day, somewhere between like 2 and 7 p.m. And so ideally charging for electric vehicles are happening outside of those hours, and you can structure electric rates so that it incentivizes charging at those outside of those hours. So we've been pushing for that. And in fact, there is some requirements in the clean energy and offshore wind law that do require the electric distribution companies, the utilities, to pitch to the DPU new rates. So we will be involved in that process. So all of that, I would say, is something we've been thinking about, we will be involved in, and something that, you know, frankly, municipalities can get involved as well. It's just a fairly time-consuming process to get involved before the DPU.
Yeah, because I just want to make sure we don't turn everything electric and then we don't have the electric capacity to keep our services running. So that was one of them. Okay.
Sorry, I just want to add one piece, is that we are going to see the need for new electric substations. So the way, forgive me if this is really basic, and you already know this, but most people don't. When you have a power plant that's generating electricity, it's a very high voltage. It goes through these large transmission lines, and then that voltage has to be stepped down in voltage in order for it to be transferred to the poles and wires that we see coming to our homes and businesses and schools. So that sort of step down in voltage process requires a substation. So these are very industrial looking facilities that you might see near a number of transit stations and beyond. But we do know that there's going to be proposals for more of these facilities. And we want to make sure that, you know, these facilities are not sited in flood zones, for example, or in places that are going to be at risk for other climate issues. So I will just say we are thinking about it holistically, and I just want you all to be thinking about the fact that we're going to need more build out of infrastructure to make that happen.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate the holistic outlook there. Anyone else have questions? Oh, I'm sorry, Colette, just saw your hand.
So I don't exactly have a question, just a couple of comments. I would love to have the slides of this, and I'm so glad you're recording it, Brian, because I'm going to have to watch it at least twice more. It's just so much information coming to us from so many sources and so many things right now that I don't know about anybody else, but I find it challenging to keep up to date with where we are on everything. And I'm trying to think about this from our perspective here in Wellesley. We have 2 great big parking lots by the train station, but we own them. So what should we be thinking about in terms of if there are rules about how many charging stations have to be at parking lots? That now falls into our sort of responsibility, and do those timelines affect us? You know, I'd like to kind of understand that a little bit better. And one thing I would say, we have our own municipal light plant, so you know we're able to manage things a little bit differently, but we're still facing the same challenges everybody else is in terms of trying to source cleaner power. And it can be challenging for small individual municipal light plants to bid on power purchasing contracts because, you know, we're not a big player. So we need some help with that. And one thing I'd love to hear your thoughts on, if we're needing more new substations, especially near train stations, which are in the middle of our town, talk to me about zoning. And I know that's going to be challenging. We know what it's like to have any change, especially when it's not particularly attractive, but it's emergent. And so I understand that there are issues with not being in floods, but you know, is it going to be by, I'm not sure this is the right word, but by right? What kind of zoning and appeal process are we going to have to face to get these things through? So I'd be interested in that.
Yeah, I love all of that thinking. First of all, Colette, yes, I will send the slides. So I will definitely send them so you have access to it. In terms of Wellesley or other municipal requirements for citing charging stations, the law doesn't say that at least one of the 5 stations has to be in Wellesley, for example. But if Wellesley is interested in its MBTA lot being, or city lot being the location, then I would say pitching that to the MBTA sooner rather than later would be helpful. And I think that I know there's now a state plan that's been approved by the federal government that MassDOT has to have more electric vehicle charging infrastructure located. I think it's within 1.5 miles of major highways. So if any of your municipalities are close to the Mass Pike or 93 or 91, well, 91's beyond your territory, but you know what I mean? Like if you're near highways, then you could be asking, or approached by the state to be hosts for charging stations. The electric distribution companies have a requirement to put a number of these charging stations in certain locations. That's not true for municipal light plants. You're sort of on your own, as you were saying, I don't believe there's a lot of coordination between municipal light plants and the distribution companies like National Grid. But certainly I think there's some good, smart people at National Grid who's been thinking about this, that it may be worth somebody in your city talking to them to think about it. So yeah, I would say there's no specific requirements for MLPs as of now, but ideally you want to be part of contributing to the transition away from fossil fuel vehicles to electric vehicles.
I have another question. So I believe when we met with Scott Hamway and he was talking about bus electrification for the MBTA, they were planning to just do in depot charging of all buses. I just wonder though, if at some point you're going to need to charge them en route, and what we may be doing and can do to make sure that we have the infrastructure for that, and maybe kind of like a system that other, larger vehicles can use, if that makes sense.
It's a wonderful question. So en route charging does require catenary wire, and we've seen the T be fairly hostile to even preserving existing catenary. And I've even heard, trying to remember if it was Scott Hamway or somebody else, very clearly say, like, we're not looking to expand catenary. So I think that's, it could be worth pushing them.
But aren't there some things now that you can put on the ground and a bus can drive over them and charge that way, or?
So that's another option. I think that's from a cost perspective, at least at this moment, I think that's a more costly option. So there are other ways to do it. And I will just say, from Conservation Law Foundation's perspective, we don't endorse any specific technology or technology company. It's and we just want to make sure the transition happens in a thoughtful and equitable way. So I think en route charging is definitely something we've asked for, and we've gotten less than lukewarm response from Scott and others.
Thank you. Kat?
Yeah, my understanding is that induction charging, it could create some issues, sort of like what we're experiencing on the Silver Line, where it makes for a really bumpy ride. Our roads get a lot of use. The only place where I've really seen it used is like University of Utah, and like a closed shuttle system where it's just, they're literally doing a loop. So it isn't super prevalent yet. I would love to push back on the catenary issue. I think one thing that I would be interested in seeing integrated into an equity analysis is that electric infrastructure component. There are so many conversations around substation infrastructure. The decisions as to where that infrastructure is located there's a massive conversation there, and I think it needs to be addressed head on so that we're not creating additional environmental injustices.
I just want to respond, Kat. I love that you just said that. Part of the work that we are doing in a large statewide coalition is pushing for citing reform law. So we filed a bill that didn't pass this session. We will refile next session that talks about updating the requirements for the Energy Facility Citing Board, which has to approve new electric substations and other big infrastructure. And that analysis needs to squarely include equity, environmental justice, and it historically has not. I have been in court before and anticipate I will be in court again trying to argue the requirements here, but to the extent anybody wants to support the siting reform bill, we would welcome that.
Thanks. Corey?
Yeah, thanks for all that stuff. I've got a billion things in my head. I'm going to do my best to try to make it into an understandable stream of thought. And I will warn you, this will not be successful. So on the Cohasset side, just, it's amazing because a lot of topics you've brought up today are things we've kind of struggled in our own little island. Cohasset at the end of the electrical line, I think we've got like the worst performance of the whole national grid network. So the last 24 months, we've been working really hard on a brick grant for a microgrid within Cohasset. Part of that, part of that could use vehicle to grid technology with school buses, on-site solar, rotating generators that were clean, all that kind of stuff. I want to echo Brian's point about talking with DPU or other people, just not really being on the same level of knowledge as maybe some of us would hope. So that's certainly a big thing. And then I guess the question I have really for the group is, how do we turn, what's our role in this committee? How do we turn this stuff into some sort of policy recommendation? And, because obviously we want to push the MBTA, we want to at least be able to use the advisory committee to make some suggestions to see these things. So, understanding all these things, what are the ways that we can bring environmental justice, perspectives to the next steps here. That was one thing that came up during the cuts. We were talking about, increase traffic through the most vulnerable neighborhoods. If you're going to cut, in our instance, the ferry service, right? If we took the ferry away, you'd have a lot of cars going through neighborhoods that were already congested and suffering. So, how do we turn this knowledge into stuff that the broader committee can get behind, and what are the steps that we really need to make clear, kind of going forward?
Well, that's a great transition, because that's what we are going to be talking about next, is what can we as a committee do and really look at our charge and see what we want to accomplish, set kind of our next meeting goals. So I'm going to ask one last parting question, and unless nobody else has another question. And Stacy and Juanita, I would just be curious, if you were on this committee, where do you think you would suggest we gear our efforts?
That's a great question. I'll give you a preliminary answer. I'd also love to hear Juanita's, and then perhaps we can circle back after we all marinate on this. I think a written report that combines the information I shared today with your knowledge around MBTA procurement policies that say, here's what you need to do. Here's sort of the number of vehicles that should be in the electric procurement pipeline, just like really setting out a detailed timeline for them with the legal requirements, I think would be ideal. And then I would welcome the chance for us to be working together to just hold them accountable to that over time. It seems to me that there's no other entity that's going to do that. And I think it just makes a lot of sense for us to be working together. So I think that's the way to do it, because we so often are going before the MBTA board and saying, don't make this decision, don't buy 160 enhanced electric hybrids. And then there's but we don't say what's next, and they come back with their information, but we don't come back at them with our data and analysis. So that's my recommendation.
Thanks, Stacey, because that very much helped me for my preliminary one. I think laying out the opportunities that, not too much focusing maybe on what has been missed, but the present, and I think future opportunities to pair all of the safety upgrades that are happening with the climate upgrades that we've advocated for, but I think even more importantly that the MBTA has, they have done multiple climate vulnerability assessments. I think one of the last ones was finished this summer. I'm not sure if there are others that are in process right now, but there are so many opportunities to marry not not just the upgrades, but I think the worldview, and in terms of like viewing the network holistically and viewing climate and safety and justice together. And so I think leaning on them to use the resources that they already have and have already compiled to move the needle forward.
I have one quick question, if I wouldn't mind. In that presentation, I remember there was a touch on rail electrification, but it doesn't sound like that's part of the, mandate towards electrification like we have for buses. Is that a correct understanding? Like there is no such for rail?
It's correct. That got removed from the language in the conference committee from the most recent climate law this summer. So
Okay.
we there was a requirement for the MBTA to do an assessment of when they could do their electrification. All that language was removed, and the governor actually pitched some different language that's just sitting idle because the formal session has ended. I can guarantee you we will be working with others to file a bill that sets timelines for rail, and in particular focusing on the Rail Vision recommendations from the Fiscal and Management Control Board back in 2019.
Sure, and that's an issue that's really dear to the South Shore because of the Greenbush line, which literally are up against people's houses because people built up to the right of way. So anything you need on that front for outreach, please. I'll get my contact information because we've got a lot of people that are passionate about that, getting the pollution out of their back windows. So
perfect.
Anything you need.
That's great. Thanks.
Great. Anyone have anything else? Any further questions, comments before we, as a committee, just kind of focus on what our next steps are?
Let me just say, Stacy, I'll be following up, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much for the invitation. Really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been super helpful.
Thanks, everyone.
So, okay, so committee, where do we go from here? So we got that really wonderful recommendation for a written report with a timeline. It sounds like what we really need to do is get kind of all the entities on board and make sure everybody has all the same information and that we're all moving in the same direction. It sounded like potentially, correct me if I'm wrong, I also heard, I don't know who the right person is, but like somehow understanding the grid and how we can make it resilient. So go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. So I guess what I would suggest, if there is an appetite, and I think there is we have a few bucks. Why don't we talk with Stacy and Juanita and folks in their world, find out who the best sort of third party working on these things is that does both transportation and environment. We'll hire them to draft something for us that matches the T's procurement timelines to the legal requirement timelines, and then see where the gaps are. And to me, those gaps then fill in where the TCIP needs to be. And then I would suggest kind of a 1-2 punch of if we can get Stacy and Juanita and CLF to give a very similar presentation to this one to the board with that gap analysis at the back. To me, it makes it pretty clear that they can't approve a CIP without filling in those gaps, frankly. And the T violates lots of state laws, and we let them get away with it. There's also, there's the ultimate sanction, which is we could bring them to court. I don't think we want to do that. We'll leave that to you, Stacy and Juanita. But we do have additional authority through our board member on the T board. And I think we're going to be getting additional authority in whatever new legislation around the T passes in 23. And I think if we, push it in this direction, it'll only strengthen our hand, especially with the legislature and the folks that really care about the, mitigating the effect of climate change as best we can. So that's my suggestion is we get a third party to do some of the legwork. Ramir and I can do it. but it would be better done by folks that do this all the time.
It's good to know. I didn't know there was money for such things. So that's, do we need to, so we probably need to take a motion on that, right?
I guess what I would suggest,
Mull it
Susan,
over, get back to you.
why don't you let me and Amira and folks think about a scope.
Yeah.
And then we'll run it by you and
Get it in writing.
Yeah.
That'd be
Yeah,
great.
if you want to get the committee back together to mull it over, that's the best way to do it, I would suggest.
That sounds good. Other thoughts? Again, I really, to me, the grid, I just really want to understand that. I'm not sure if how this committee feels that we could have any impact on that. I mean, that I guess is outside that is not just the MBTA. So maybe that is outside the charge of this group.
But I guess I agree with you, Susan, it's bigger than this group, but I don't think there's a problem with us calling attention to the fact that it's really concerning to us, because, you know, I think the more noise that's given to that issue, the better, because, you know, I hear that all the time. And we're trying to focus on it on our own, with our own MLP, but there's a lot of pushback about how on earth are you going to square the circle of making everything electric when the grid's not ready for it. I mean, we hear it all the time. I actually really like Brian's suggestion, particularly that sort of matching up the law with the procurement, I think is really important. But I think we need to educate the advisory board writ large. So, you know, this wasn't a very long presentation. So whenever we can work this into the advisory board, I think it'd be worthwhile. We all need to just be continually educated on this, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I also, so I think Brian's suggestion is great. I think we've got like the visionary goal of kind of what we're trying to, the message we're trying to get, but then you're pairing that with an actionable goal. And I think talking about procurement, that's what we did in our town, which is we laid out the lease schedule for the school buses and then said, well, before we do anything here, let's be sure we talk about electrification before we make any decisions going forward. And that was just a very way to integrate this new, the new priorities into just our purchasing process. So I think getting something that's, well presented and pretty straightforward as a demand to say, if you're going to go forward, you need to take into account these, the legal requirements makes all the sense in the world.
Thank you. Layla? Oh, you're muted, Layla.
Sorry, I clicked lower hand and I was like, I'm unmuted now. Okay, so Juanita you mentioned that the MBTA has vulnerability assessments that it has already conducted. And so I'm curious whether this group, what are the possibilities, if any, to advise on sort of resilience and adaptation as well alongside the energy and electrification aspects that we've been talking about.
So look, were you saying like get our hands on those vulnerability reports?
I think I guess more along the lines of like, would we be able to advise on what resilience, I guess we would need to know the assessment in that case, but like what resilience could look like for the T, or we strictly energy focused on the transportation system.
Well, Susan, if I could just try to answer that as best I can. I mean, the fact is that pretty much every MBTA facility, yard, garage, et cetera, is built in a floodplain or right against the water. They're just there. And siting new facilities for rail and bus maintenance is really hard. Now, they just did it in Quincy at a place that I don't think is in a floodplain. I actually don't know that. But one of the things that we also need to really wrestle with as a region and as a Commonwealth is where are we going to put these things? Now, clean bus facilities are a lot easier to site than dirty ones, which is another reason why they have to just get better at it. But their vulnerability assessments, which are public, basically just talk about how everything they have is pretty much guaranteed to flood when sea levels rise. I think the Orient Heights Blue Line facility is first, followed by, Charlestown Albany garage is in a former wetland. I mean, it's everything they have is basically about to get very wet. So, you know, it's a big issue. And you're absolutely right. We should think about that. And that is something that they need to begin to address through their capital programming process, which we have a role to play in influencing.
Great. Anything else? We're coming up with just about 8 minutes left. Okay, so it sounds like our next steps is that we would have Brian and Amira get back to us with a proposal to hire someone to help us draft out that plan, linking legal obligations, so forth together, that can then be carried forward to the MBTA and others. So that would probably be our next meeting, kind of reviewing that. Okay.
That's what I heard.
Okay. That sounds good. Anything else?
Can we chat briefly about when you want to do that? Timeline.
Yeah, I know you had a series of other meetings coming up, which I don't have right in front of me. Well, how soon do you think you could actually pull something like that together?
It's not rocket science. I mean, we can pull it
Yeah.
together in October,
Whatever.
probably November, December timeline. And, you know, that's even something that if you, well, how about we say sort of November, December? Let's have a committee meeting, November, December timeline.
Okay. That sounds good.
I don't know if
Maybe
you wanna
aim
look at
before all the holidays that tend to tie people up. Okay.
That'd be great.
Alrighty.
And I guess just, you know, to Stacy and Juanita, I'm going to be coming back to you, seeing if you have suggestions on who does this kind of work and who we might want to work with. Because I know the usual suspects, but I think this might be a little more nuanced. So
Sounds great.
thank you again.
Okay. Great. Well, this has been good. Possibly we're going to end a few minutes early, unless somebody has anything else. No. Okay. Well,
I mean, can we do
right.
the minutes that we
Oh,
did?
oh gosh, I'm so sorry. That's right. We skipped that. Yes. Where? Oh. Has everyone had a chance to review the minutes? I just realized I don't have it in front of me. Got to. Somehow I thought I had everything in front of me. Okay, well, we would need, you know,
So, yeah, you just need a motion in a second, and then
yeah, I'm just checking something. Were these?
Did I send the wrong ones?
I see 2 attachments, which are both agenda.
I was just going to ask if we could postpone this because I know I had not reviewed them because I couldn't find them and I thought it was just me, and I'm sorry because I'm scrambling a bit today, so my apologies.
No, that was me. I apologize. Yeah, let's hold that. We'll do it next time.
And my
Same
apologies
experience
that I
here.
didn't catch that.
It's on me.
So,
Sorry about that.
okay, sounds good. Okay, so we'll do the minutes next time. We'll have 2 sets. Thank you.
Postponed.
All right, so I guess we can adjourn unless there's something else.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you,
All right.
everyone. Appreciate everyone
everyone.
being here. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.